Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2023 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Jenny Rushlow, Dean of Vermont School for the Environment, and we're very pleased to welcome you to our presentation today. Each of these talks is worth one Vermont CLE credit, so please keep track of which talks you attend for your records. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation today. So if you're watching on our YouTube or Facebook pages, you just need to enter your questions in the chat or the comment space, and we'll get through as many as we can. And you can enter those questions at any time during the presentation. Today, we're very pleased to welcome Miranda Wilson. Miranda is a reporter at E&E News, where she focuses on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, energy infrastructure, and the U.S. power grid. Her reporting has documented how the nation's top energy regulator is responding to climate change, environmental justice concerns, and the complex barriers to renewable energy deployment. She was previously a local reporter at the Las Vegas Sun and the Medford Transcript in Massachusetts. She joins us this term as one of our summer environmental media fellows, which is selected from a highly competitive pool of applicants. And today her presentation is called How New Clean Energy Could Benefit from Old Coal Plants. Please join me in welcoming Miranda Wilson.
Thank you for that introduction, Jenny. So I'm going to go ahead and get my slideshow going and share my screen. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to my Hot Topics talk today. As Jenny mentioned, my name is Miranda Wilson, and I'm an environmental media fellow here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. And the title of my talk is How New Clean Energy Could Benefit from Old Coal Plants. So I'll just start by sharing a little bit about myself. I'm a reporter with E&D News, which is an energy and environmental news site that is owned by Politico. And my coverage area includes FERC, as Jenny mentioned, but also sort of trends in energy policy and challenges and opportunities in the transition to carbon-free electricity. Also, before I begin, I just want to say thank you to Vermont Law and Graduate School for having me these past 2 weeks as an environmental media fellow. It's been really nice to be in a classroom setting for a little bit and sort of get a new legal perspective on some of the topics I report on. Can everyone see can you all see my screen? Is that not working?
I can't see it.
Okay. Sorry. Try this again. Is it working now?
No, it looks like we're looking at a Google Doc, but that it's blank. Oh, now we can see your slides. Yep.
Okay. Sorry. Okay.
Looks good.
Okay. So where was I? Yes. I've been here for the past 2 weeks just at Vermont Law School, and it's been an amazing opportunity to be in a classroom setting for a little bit. yeah, so just really grateful for this opportunity. Okay, let's get into my talk now. Why coal and clean energy? So this talk is inspired by a little bit by an article of mine that I wrote recently. But if for some reason you have seen the article, there are some new details and kind of context and flavor in this presentation, so it should still be of interest. But yeah, it generated a lot of interest among readers of E&E News and touched on a lot of the topics that I'm interested in as a reporter. So I decided to expand on it a little bit for you all and break it down in a way that I hope will make sense to everyone listening. Okay. So this is a photo of a coal plant in Homer City, Pennsylvania. It's called the Homer City Generating Station. It opened in 1969, and it was the largest remaining coal plant in the state until it closed on July 1st of this year. And the reasons it closed sort of reflects a little bit what's going on with coal-fired electricity right now. Coal has been a major source of power in the U.S. For decades. But recently it's been experiencing a lot of economic challenges. Homer City closing in Pennsylvania is particularly kind of a big deal because Pennsylvania historically was a really big coal hub. They had tons of coal production in the 19th and 20th centuries. And by some estimates, they have more abandoned mine lands now than any other state. So even Pennsylvania is being affected by these trends in the coal sector that are mostly driven by economics. A couple of months ago, I was working on a different article about energy policy in Pennsylvania and sort of looking at how coal plants like Homer City are closing because of these difficult economic headwinds for coal, which is struggling to compete with natural gas and renewable energy, even in states like Pennsylvania that have historically mined a lot of coal. And so the story was about, used Homer City kind of as a hook, given that it just closed, but sort of about what happens next for Pennsylvania in terms of energy policy and jobs. There's currently not a lot of renewable energy in the state, and there is a lot of natural gas production and natural gas power plants. So the story was about how, is that trend going to continue, or is there going to be more solar in Pennsylvania? And it also talked about how one reason why there's some uncertainty is questions about whether Pennsylvania is going to join a cap and invest program called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. Just some information about coal. For those who don't know, as I mentioned, it's struggling to compete with cheaper fuels. There's also new environmental regulations from the EPA that are requiring plants to upgrade in certain ways, and that's expensive. So some of these plants are just closing instead of opting to do those upgrades. And then in Pennsylvania, there's this question about whether the state's going to join this multi-state carbon trading program called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI. What happens next for a state like Pennsylvania? This story focused a little bit on Homer City because in addition to being the largest remaining coal plant in the state, it was also sort of a poster child for RGGI. There's basically the way RGGI works is there's a cap on carbon emissions for all the states that participate. And so power plant owners need to purchase allowances for every ton of CO2 that they emit. And over time, there are fewer allowances available. So that gradually drives emissions down. And the state has been in kind of a legal battle over the former governor's attempt to participate in RGGI. since 2020. And many of the state lawmakers in the Pennsylvania legislature that have been most opposed were from the area where Homer City is. So it's kind of this interesting dynamic because, Pennsylvania is not in RGGI, but because of all these other factors, coal plants are closing anyway. And now the sort of RGGI poster child for the potential impacts of RGGI closed, even though the state hasn't been able to join because of litigation. So the story was talking about what does that say about coal, and how is Pennsylvania going to ensure that coal communities kind of affected by these plant closures can sort of stay afloat economically, and is Pennsylvania's future going to be gas or renewable energy? So I say all that to just give a little bit of background on, so you understand that we're seeing a lot of coal plant closures. But, as I was interviewing someone for this piece, a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, she made sort of an offhand comment where she said, with a lot of these plants closing, the real question is what is going to happen to their capacity interconnection rights? So I thought that was interesting. It wasn't really relevant to that story I was writing, but I kind of made a mental note of it. And then I wrote my Pennsylvania RGGI coal story. And then I decided to come back to this question that she had brought up in our interview. So what happens to the capacity interconnection rights at a plant that closes, at a power plant that closes? So I'm sure many of you are wondering what are capacity interconnection rights? What is interconnection? Why does this matter? It is a little wonky, but I'm going to explain all that. So to kind of understand this story, in addition to sort of understanding what's going on with coal, you also have to understand what's going on with renewable energy and the power grid. So interconnection. I was trying to find a photo of a traffic jam and I picked this one and I feel like it's not really that dramatic. It doesn't look like the traffic's that bad, but it is what it is. Right now in the US, there are a ton of new solar and wind and battery storage projects that are being proposed for development pretty much all over the country. And that's, good news for anyone who is concerned about climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But in order for all of these new projects to come online, they have to connect to the grid, which entails going through a process called interconnection. And many of the people I regularly interview for my reporting all the time, talk a lot about this and have told me that this sort of interconnection system is really becoming a big hurdle for deploying a much larger amount of renewable energy. And they say that that's because the system is somewhat outdated. It's not necessarily an efficient connection process for the kind of resources that we're trying to build, that the market is sort of favoring, which is renewables, and that a lot of states are favoring to advance their clean energy goals. For example, some of the most climate forward states in the country, they have goals to have an entirely carbon-free power grid by 2040 or 2045, something like that. And many of them also have interim goals. So, 50% renewables on the grid by 2030. And yet most places you still have really mostly natural gas and to a smaller extent, some coal. that is, and other sources too, that are still providing the vast majority of power. So there's kind of a crunch for a lot of states, and also for the Biden administration's goal of entirely carbon-free power grid by 2035. And the interconnection process is part of what is driving this real time crunch and some delays for projects coming online. And just to explain this a little bit more, part of why there's this traffic jam is, like I mentioned, there are so many projects being proposed. They're in many cases smaller than the traditional power plants we have on the system right now in terms of their the amount of electricity they would generate. And in order for these projects to be approved to connect, they have to be studied. And the studies are carried out by either utility companies in some parts of the country, or in many regions, including here in the Northeast, by regional grid operators. And these regional grid operators or regional transmission organizations just in many respects don't really have the manpower to process all these requests in a really timely manner. And at the same time, so with solar and wind, you really need to build it where you have good solar resources or you have good wind resources. So that sometimes means that you need to upgrade the grid more extensively in order for them to connect and come online. And so, yeah, this is all kind of causing some significant delays in the interconnection process, including in the regional power grid that Pennsylvania is part of, which is known as PJM. So why is this an issue for states and environmental advocates, anyone else advocating for clean energy? Sorry for the big block of text on this slide, but I thought this was a really interesting excerpt. This is from a letter that Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro wrote back in May to PJM, the regional grid operator, talking about this interconnection problem. And he frames it in a pretty interesting way, I think. So he says, as existing generation sources announce retirement and go offline, that generation cannot be replaced in a timely manner. Delays in the interconnection queue are hampering our ability to bring new generation online in Pennsylvania, resulting in stranded assets and missed opportunities. These same delays are also making it harder for legacy plants that are going offline, like Homer City, the plant I mentioned earlier, to be reinvented in ways that maintain jobs and continue to be assets for their local communities. So he calls for a faster pathway for reconnection at previously shut down sites to expedite the interconnection process for new on-site generation opportunities that can replace these old power plants that are closing. So I thought this, was an interesting letter, and it's going to be relevant to why Homer City is sort of a great case study for this. So as I mentioned, Pennsylvania is part of a regional power grid called PJM, which is the largest regional transmission organization in the country in terms of the amount of population it serves. It serves about 65 million people in 13 states and DC, where I live. And this is a nice little shot of their control room, where they sort of assess the conditions on the grid in real time, which is part of their role. They're sort of they're not a government entity, they're a nonprofit, and they're kind of stakeholder driven by the utility companies in this region, and also the power plant owners, the renewable energy companies, the states. Sort of an interesting mix of political dynamics sometimes. So in PJM, which is a relatively densely populated area, it now takes several years in some cases for a new energy project to be studied and by the engineers who work at PJM and then approved to connect to the transmission system or to the power grid. And it's worth noting that, over 90% of the new energy projects being proposed in PJM are solar, wind, and battery storage projects. And that's very similar to how it is all over the US in terms of the trends and the types of generation that is being proposed right now for development. So these interconnection challenges are a problem because you have, most old, mostly coal, but also some other types of power plants that are retiring. And, you need to get more new energy projects onto the system so that you can replace those plants, you can keep the lights on, maintain reliability. And, it's also a problem for some of the states in PJM and in other regions where where these delays are happening. For the states that have extensive renewable energy goals, as I mentioned. To be clear, PJM recently implemented some changes to its sort of interconnection process that it says will really help deal with this backlog. They're well aware of the issue and they're definitely trying to address it. But it's still right now considered a pretty big hurdle to deploying a lot more renewable energy, especially it seems in sort of the eastern US. Okay. And then here's just, this is some data from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which shows you the interconnection queues right now and going back to 2014. And that just shows how many new projects are being proposed and why there's this difficulty in processing them. You can see on the left, you have solar, storage, wind. That's where there's been a huge jump in the capacity is what's measured here, but also just in the number of projects being proposed. And if you were to go back further, like before 2014, you would see this even more. If you were to go back to 2004, there'd be way less renewable energy in the queue. You might have some more gas, nuclear, coal in the queues, but probably not the amount of capacity in the renewables that we're seeing right now. So just for some more flavor, so Berkeley Lab actually estimated that in 2022, the interconnection requests nationwide grew by 40% compared to the year before. And they also have estimated that as of last year, there was about as much proposed new electric capacity in the queues just from solar and wind alone, as there is capacity that's already installed. So you have, in terms of the amount of new renewable energy being proposed, it's about equal to all of the electricity we have on the grid system right now. It's important to note, like, not all of these projects will get built. Probably many of them won't. There are some potential problems with sort of, there's maybe some incentives that incentivize companies that are developing projects to put their projects in the queue, even if they're not really super far along in the development process. That can be an issue. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but yeah, definitely worth noting. Not all these will get built, but it still shows, if you're in the queue, you have to be studied. And so that slows everything down. Okay, so back to the Homer City coal plant. So if you are a plant that has been in service for decades, or just are in service in general, you are already connected to the grid, right? You've been providing power to customers, and you have what are known as capacity interconnection rights, that term I mentioned earlier. So in Homer City's case, they decided to close because of partly because of new environmental regulations from the EPA, and having trouble competing with gas and renewables that are largely becoming cheaper than coal. And it's an old plant. So you have that, but then, let's say you have a company that is building a solar farm or a battery storage project. You don't have those capacity interconnection rights if you're not interconnected yet. So you can't start making money off the project until you have that. So the question that I've been exploring in my reporting is kind of, can these two entities sort of find some kind of deal on these capacity interconnection rights? Can you reuse the grid connection infrastructure at a coal plant or other, fossil fuel plant that is closing for a new renewable energy project? Can that sort of provide one solution to these interconnection delays that are causing a lot of concerns, so that you can bring clean energy online faster and potentially reduce the costs of the clean energy transition? So, the answer is maybe. So everything's complicated. So I'm going to talk about that. So why does this matter? As we know, there's an urgent need to address climate change and reduce greenhouse gas emissions if we are to avoid sort of the worst impacts of climate change. And that likely means, according to most analyses of what a clean grid could look like, building a lot of solar and wind. But connecting these new energy projects can take a long time. There are also siting difficulties. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, is kind of trying to fix this. But the solutions need to come soon if states want to meet those interim renewable energy targets, especially. So reusing these old power plant sites could potentially, be a way to speed up the connection process while retaining energy jobs in these communities that have hosted these plants for years. And it could maybe lower costs because you could be reusing grid assets rather than building new ones, like a new substation or something like that. But yeah, the question is, how much can this really solve the interconnection problem? And also, what are some of the other issues that this raises? Because there's a lot of interest in this idea of reusing old sites, but it's kind of complicated. This pretty janky looking map shows the different regional transmission organizations in the US. So you can see PJM that I mentioned. And so as it turns out, when I started looking into this question of, can you reuse capacity interconnection rights for a new clean energy project, Homer City in Pennsylvania was actually a really good example for sort of explaining this. So as I mentioned, Homer City is this big coal plant. It just closed, but it hasn't been decommissioned yet. And it is located about 50 or so miles from Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania in the PJM region, and about 100 miles from the border with New York State, which is part of a different grid region called the New York ISO. Being in Pennsylvania, the project, of course, has been providing power for PJM, for that entire large region that serves 65 million customers. But the interesting thing is, there is also a large transmission line that goes from Homer City all the way up to New York, to Western New York, where the border is. And that is pretty unusual. So it's due to sort of a strange, or it's just kind of the history around how the grid was built out. I believe that one of the original companies that built Homer City was a electric utility in New York. So that's probably why they have this power line going all the way up there. I don't know why they built a coal plant so far away, but they did. But so what this means is that this site of this plant has connection to PJM and to New York ISO, which of course includes the largest city in the country, New York City. And that means if you have capacity interconnection rights at where this plant is located, you can sell power into New York or PJM. And that makes it really valuable from a, for a developer of a potential new project at this site. And that just shows you that these capacity interconnection rights, depending on where they are, can be really valuable if you're trying to develop a new energy project. So for all these reasons, there seems to be quite a bit of interest among clean energy developers, utility companies, legacy power plant owners, and also some environmental groups and environmental research organizations in figuring out how we can potentially capitalize on the interconnection rights at one plant when it closes for helping connect new energy projects. And right now in particular, there's a lot of discussions about this in PJM. As I mentioned, it's sort of a stakeholder-driven nonprofit. So, all the utilities and other energy companies are sort of just beginning a process around some of the possibilities of doing this sort of transfer of capacity interconnection rights and some of the sort of thorny legal and other questions. And then there's also another reason why there's interest in this topic right now. And that's because of, there's some new tax credits from the Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA was passed last year, biggest climate spending law in US history. A lot of that sort of the main provisions of the IRA have to do with tax credits. And so one thing that the IRA did was it created this bonus tax credit for certain clean energy projects located in energy communities. And one way you would qualify for this bonus credit is by building a project in a census tract where a coal plant recently closed. So that basically means, there are going to be, there may be more developers looking to reuse former power plant sites because you can get a more valuable tax credit if you build there, because you can qualify for this bonus tax credit, this new bonus tax credit. Okay. So yeah, the question is though, can there be some kind of deal, I guess, between the owner of a plant that's closing and someone who's trying to develop something new with these capacity interconnection rights. And it might seem like this is kind of straightforward, but it's not necessarily the case. And, one reason, of course, is there's a lot of different factors that go into where you build a project, a clean energy project. So and it also depends on where in the country you're located, because there's different rules around this, depending on if you're in an RTO or a non-RTO, or, if you're in California versus in PJM, et cetera. But so, yeah, if you are the owner of a coal plant in PJM, for example, that is closing, maybe you want to reuse your capacity interconnection rights for a new project that you want to build. Maybe you want to build a battery storage plant there. Or maybe you just want to hold on to those rights in case you want to do something with them at some point. But one of the questions that they're grappling with in PJM is, should you kind of be allowed to go through sort of a faster interconnection process if you already have the capacity interconnection rights? So remember that interconnection process takes years in many cases now. And so is it fair if you are a new solar company that is waiting in the interconnection queue, is it fair for the owner of a former coal plant to kind of be able to reuse their interconnection rights right away for a new project and kind of bypass that process? So that's kind of one of the questions that this raises. And one of the people who is, has some kind of reservations about this, or wants to make sure that it's done in a way that makes sense in PJM, is the independent market monitor. So all the regional transmission organizations, I believe all of them do, have a market monitor who is sort of observes everything that's going on in the electricity market, to see if there's wrongdoing, that kind of thing. And so this is just something he told me. It's a bit wonky, but I'll explain it. So he says, is it appropriate to allow such transfers of proposed new projects that may be years from an in-service date, rather than making the capacity more generally available to the next resources in line in the queue? That is one of the concerns, I guess, that is coming up. And the other thing that's worth mentioning, of course, is this kind of transfer isn't necessarily going to work for every clean energy project. You can't build a solar or wind farm just anywhere. You might not, you might need more land. So there's potentially limited applications for this. And maybe the best ways that this could work is if you're building possibly a community solar facility that doesn't need as much land, or just a big battery, or maybe like a green hydrogen plant. Those might be the most suited for a former coal plant or other fossil fuel power plant. Potentially limited applications, but it can work. So here's an example. This was a deal that was reached January 2020, where an offshore wind farm in New Jersey purchased the capacity interconnection rights of this other company, RC Cape May Holdings, which is they owned a coal plant that had just closed the year before. So the offshore wind developer filed this copy of the purchase agreement with the New Jersey Public Utilities Commission. I don't know how much they paid for these rights because it was redacted in the public copy. But I would guess that they saved some money, because what they're doing is using the substation at this former coal plant to interconnect this offshore wind farm. And that probably allowed them to, not have to pay for a new substation. That's huge. So these transfers can happen. Another example, so there's a company called Elevate Renewable Energy that seems to sort of have a business model kind of around reusing old grid infrastructure. So Elevate Renewable Energy is a subsidiary of ArcLight Capital Partners, which is a private equity firm. The private equity company owns a lot of natural gas plants, including this one in New Jersey, hydro projects, pipelines. They have a big portfolio of all kinds of projects, but they started this subsidiary, Elevate, that is pretty much solely developing battery storage projects at gas and oil plants that ArcLight is planning to retire. And their goal is to reuse the substations and the capacity interconnection rights at those plants And they've been a big voice in the PJM stakeholder process around kind of trying to make this transfer process and connection process at these kinds of sites a little bit easier. And one thing that's interesting is, when I interviewed Elevate, they described this as like an energy and environmental justice issue. They want to basically seamlessly transition their fossil fuel power plants to battery storage, which they say, can help the communities nearby continue to sort of get tax revenue by having an energy, another energy plant in their community, and then also getting benefits from reduced air pollution. And so, that's an interesting, I think, concept when you think about communities living in the shadow of coal and oil and gas fired power plants. They've been dealing with pollution. And so, Elevate says that this is a way to sort of make sure they benefit in the energy transition. There's some other reasons why I think this is an interesting idea. If you're using land that's already been disturbed, you may not have as much of the environmental impact as you would if you are, removing trees or a green pasture or something for solar. If you're doing it at a former power plant site, you don't really need to do that as much. And you may also have fewer kind of permitting and land rights issues because, again, the site is already being used for an energy project. So the Department of Energy is interested in this too. So actually, after I wrote this article, I got an email from DOE and they told me something which I hadn't known, which is that there is a clean energy financing program that was modified through the IRA and is being run out of the DOE Loans Program Office. And so they will help finance clean energy projects that retool, repower, repurpose, or replace energy infrastructure that has stopped operating if it's a new project that's going to reduce emissions. So you can get a direct loan from Treasury to help redevelop these kinds of sites now. So I think DOE was disappointed that I didn't mention that in my article. I just unfortunately didn't know. I don't know the Inflation Reduction Act by heart, sadly. But I thought I'd mention it now. Okay. I love this photo. This is an offshore wind farm in the North Sea called North Sea Offshore Wind Farm. But yeah, to summarize, I think this notion of reusing capacity interconnection rights is intriguing, and it's seems to be somewhat hot right now, at least in PJM, where you have really bad, or really, longer, kind of more difficult queue challenges in some respects for the grid connection process. But, there are obviously limitations with reusing a site like this. But to me, I think the reason why there's a lot of interest in this is because of how hard it is to get renewable energy online in sort of the pace that many people, people like Governor Shapiro and environmental advocates, want to see. A lot of states want to rapidly transition to cleaner resources. Biden administration wants to do this nationwide, but there's siting issues, there are interconnection issues, and in many ways, I think this is just, you're seeing this interest in kind of getting creative by reusing these old sites because we're trying to build a pretty new energy system and pretty different kind of resource mix and power grid using these same old processes that are not necessarily working super efficiently with the types of resources that we have coming online now. And I think the larger question is, can we do something about that larger issue? So, does anyone have any questions?
Thank you so much, Miranda. So for our attendees, we do have a few minutes for you all to ask some questions, and you can do that by entering your question in the chat or the comment space on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll get to as many as we can. To kick things off, Miranda, can you talk a little bit about how this concept might advantage or disadvantage renewable energy deployment in particular regions relative to one another in the US?
Yeah. So I think the main way it could sort of advantage or disadvantage renewable energy is kind of about who's trying to use this process and who's trying to build this way. One concern for some renewable energy developers is, they want the larger queue problem in terms of the interconnection process to kind of be the focus of what changes are addressed to kind of get that queue process going faster. And so they don't necessarily want to kind of look at this as a really widespread solution because it's somewhat limited. And also, there's potential concern about, if you are a company that owns power plants, should you kind of get to hold on to that capacity interconnection right and use it for a new project? Does that kind of disadvantage the newer sort of companies that are building renewable energy from a grid connection perspective? So I don't know exactly how the process works in all different regions of the country, but certainly there have been a few FERC decisions actually relating to this. I want to say at least one major utility in the South kind of proposed, they're not in an RTO, and so it works different. They proposed sort of a replacement process for their own region to make it easier to build like a solar plant or something when that utility closes a coal plant or something like that. But that's a little different because you don't really have as many different players building projects in the South.
So with the recent sort of replacement of the Clean Power Plan from the Biden administration following the West Virginia decision from the Supreme Court, there looks to be an expansion of carbon capture in our future. So can you talk a little bit about how that potential likely shift might change the conditions that you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the big questions around what's going to kind of happen to the energy resource mix with, assuming that is finalized and upheld, that EPA proposal is, are you going to see a lot of plants, a lot of coal and gas plants install carbon capture, or are you going to see more or are many of them going to close? So I guess, there's a possibility that, the rule could lead to more of these plants, maybe that would otherwise be closing, stay open and use carbon capture. And so then I guess that, limits the potential to transfer the capacity interconnection rights if they continue operating. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, I think the big question in general with that is just how much carbon capture is going to take off, and how much that's going to, I guess, prolong or sort of continue result in coal and gas plants staying open for longer.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about how certain types of renewable projects are more able to move into, a random particular property based on where a coal plant happened to have been. And you listed off a few of the types of clean energy projects that may be more able to do that. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of relative strength of the type of renewable projects or clean energy projects that can fit in coal plants versus those that can't? Because we do tend to see a preference in development for solar and wind, but obviously that's not the full portfolio.
Yeah. Well, so I think I mentioned battery storage as being but that's what I had heard, maybe sort of one of the technologies where this could work well, because if you're just building a big battery, that doesn't take up a ton of land, so, and there's obviously benefits to having more batteries, because it provides sort of a relatively short-term kind of clean energy storage option. I think hydrogen was another one I mentioned. There aren't a lot of plants right now in the US or anywhere really that are not many places at least that are running on clean hydrogen that's produced through renewable energy. But there's certainly a lot of interest in that from energy companies as sort of a potential alternative to natural gas, or a cleaner alternative to certain industrial processes, as a sort of a fuel source for heavy industry. So yeah, I think time will tell if we see sort of replacement projects that involve hydrogen. And then one of the examples I mentioned was that offshore wind project in New Jersey. So my understanding of how that worked is, like, obviously, if you're building offshore wind, you're not building the wind turbines at the coal plant. They just sort of used it as a way to sort of connect to the grid, using the old substation at that plant, the former plant. But that still involved a transfer of the capacity interconnection rights. So it doesn't necessarily have to be built exactly where the plant is, depending on sort of the specifics of the project.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll end there. Thank you for your presentation, Miranda. Super interesting. And I definitely encourage people to check out Miranda's reporting at E&E. And thank you to our audience for joining us today. Our next talk will be on Tuesday of next week at the same place, and we hope you'll join us then. Have a good weekend.